So now we've got our scale or multiple potential scales able to be stored in the collection object. Let's make a little patch that will play the scales for us automatically. So instead of me doing it live with keyboards, I'm just gonna press one button, it's just gonna go up the scale, and we'll get to hear all the notes of the scale, and then we'll use that to compare some various scales that we're able to compute. So we've been using ridiculous samples and sine waves, but let's learn a new max object called saw tilde that makes a richer spectrum. Let me give it a frequency of, let's say, 220, and doesn't look like much. Let's make this a spectroscope instead. So you can see it's got a lot of overtones, and these are in a harmonic series, so it sounds a little something like this. Okay, as compared to a single sine wave, which has the same pitch. Well, we want to get that number. But it's a very muted tone. It doesn't have any of this rich spectral component in the high frequencies. It's just a single tone. But we're going to use sawtooth waves. So going up scale 1. Okay, now one thing is that this saw is it's just continuously outputting. So we can change the frequency, but we can't make it stop. So I'm going to show you how to make a note. So we saw the line tilde object that can be at a certain value and go to another value and go to another value. So we're going to use this to make an amplitude envelope. We're going to go to full volume over 50 milliseconds, and then we're going to go back to 0 volume over 300 milliseconds. So it's going to look like this. Just a little triangular attack release envelope. Goes up fast and it comes down a little bit slower. So every time a new frequency comes out of here, we're going to first bang that message box to trigger the envelope, and then we're going to set the frequency of our sawtooth wave. So now instead of going continuously, like it is now, whoops, I'm not doing anything to the line. I'm still only listening to the saw. In order to make the amplitude envelope apply to the saw, I have to multiply them together. And we'll take a look at that, and that's what we'll listen to. So now if I turn on audio, we should hear nothing, because this line is outputting 0 right now, and 0 times whatever the saw is outputting, even though it's not nothing, 0 times anything is still 0. So now if we put a 1 in here, we just get a brief note. Pretty cool. So this is the simplest way to make a note with an amplitude envelope in Max. So that's pretty cool. So now I want to automate this. I just want it to go on its own. So we need a little bit more vertical room. So I'll move these down a bit, and we're going to use a counter. And we're going to go up to 8, I think. So what does this do? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And it keeps going up from 0 to 8. So we started our scale at 1. So I'm going to show you, there's a couple of other modes of counter. Counter has a bunch of different arguments. And it's honestly a little bit confusing. If you give one argument, it means one thing. If there's 2 arguments, it means something else. And if you have 3 arguments, it means something else. There's a whole tab of the help patch that details all this. So there are modes. You can loop upwards, you can loop downwards, you can go up and down. I kind of like that for scale. Do, do, ti, la, sol, fa, mi, re, do, to go back down. So we're going to go up and down. That's mode 2. And you say what the lowest number is and what the highest number is. So we want to go from 1 to 8. So we're going to counter mode 2 for up and down, 1 for starting at the lowest note 1, and 8 for the highest note. So counter 2, 1, 8. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So now we just need to automate it, which we can do with our friend Metro. And this is pretty good, but how's it going to know how to end? It doesn't know how to end, so that could be a problem. So let's do this 400 milliseconds apart. Let's see what happens. Right, the counter's going to keep going and going and going and going and going. So counter will tell you when it gets to the maximum, and it will tell you when it gets to the minimum. And it's going to output a flag, which is either going to be a 1 or a 0. So let's select the 0 and the 1. Let's just observe the behavior. So this becomes a 1. Wow, it's behaving quite strangely now. Now I'm confused what's happening. Seems fine, okay. So when it gets to the bottom and it outputs a 1 out this outlet, we're going to turn off the Metro. So when this happens here, we're going to say, Metro, you're done. This scale is over. So we turn it on. And it stops when it gets to the bottom. That's kind of cool. But I want to start at 1. So I'm going to make another toggle. Now I'm going to make a bang that starts everything. And what it's going to do is it's going to trigger. It's going to turn on the Metro second, and it's going to set the counter to have its next output be a 1. So we always start at the bottom of the scale. There we go. Up and down the scale using logic. So let's just clean this up a little bit. And what are we going to do now? So now let's change the scale. So what's another scale? Let's use a pentatonic scale. Let's get rid of that one and get rid of that one. Close that. We will save. And this one should be called pentatonic. And did it throw away our numbers? Yes, but luckily I copied them, so I'll just paste them back in. Close, save. Pentatonic, there it is. And again, I'm going to make sure that it's saved data with Patcher. And so we'll just swap it in for the major scale. But now we have a bit of a problem because different scales have different numbers of notes in them. This one, whoops, it threw away my major scale. I only kept my pentatonic scale. I didn't mean to do that. We'll fix that in a minute. So this up here, this argument to counter is the number of notes in the scale. But we want to ask the collection how big it is. So you can do that. There's a message you can send to the collection called length. And if you send it in there, you'll see that it will output how many, it'll tell you that there are 6 notes in the scale. But I don't want it to play the 6th note. I just want to find out how many notes there are. And I want the answer to that question to go into this inlet of the counter that sets the maximum, so that depending on how big the scale is, I'll play the right number of notes for that scale. So there's an object. A lot of people aren't a big fan of this object because it's a little bit weird. It's called grab. And what it lets you do is send a message to an object. But instead of having the answer to that message come out the outlet of that object, it comes out the outlet of grab. So this patch cord that's connecting the grab to the collection, unlike every patch cord we've seen so far in this course, where the data only flows out the outlet and into the outlet one way, this is actually a two-way connection, because now that this grab is talking to the call, if I send a length to it, then the answer that call came up with is 6. Didn't come out the outlet of call, it came out the outlet of grab. So that's the whole point of grab. It intercepts the message. And I find that I use it almost exclusively to ask a collection how big it is. And we're going to do that right here. And so now when we start our scale, we're going to do 3 things. First, we're going to ask the collection how long it is. Then we're going to set the counter to start at the first note of the scale. Then we're going to turn on the metronome. Let's see if it works. Yes, success. That's what I meant to do. So now how can we have multiple scales? First of all, let me repair my major scale. 1, 2, 3. This should be 4 being 5. This should be 5 being 7. This should be 6 being 9. And 7 being 11. Copy, close, save. There's my major scale. There's my pentatonic scale. So now switching scales is still a bit of a pain. Now we got to, if we want to go from the pentatonic scale back to the major scale, we got to move all this stuff. Let's see if it works. Okay, that worked. But that's kind of a pain, swapping all this stuff over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little database of scales over here. I'm going to put a new collection object over here called whichever scale. And I'm going to connect that to my patch. And this collection is going to somehow magically be whichever one I want. Whether it's the pentatonic or the major scale, or the world has thousands of scales, so you can imagine a huge database of scales. In fact, you can find these online. There's a lot of scale nerds out there on the internet that have all kinds of numbers that they've typed in. So we're going to use another feature of collection that I like very much called refer. So you can send collection a message that says, I want you to refer to the data in this other scale, pentatonic or major scale. I guess these are all scales, so maybe I should just call it major instead of pentatonic, instead of major scale, just for consistency's sake. So if I say refer pentatonic, if I click on this message box, and now I double click this, it brought up the data for the pentatonic scale with the 6 notes. And if I click on refer major scale, double click on it, there's our 8 notes. So here's a major scale. Just for kicks, let's transpose it up to B. Oops. I was supposed to start it by clicking on this toggle. I was supposed to start it by clicking on this button. That's why I should always make the important buttons really big to remind you how to do it. And if I refer to pentatonic and do it, it's pentatonic. So this one collection object can now hold whichever data I want to give it. So again, we can imagine a whole bunch of more scales in different collections along here, and we could refer to whichever one we wanted, and this patch would work the way we wanted to. So I'm going to save this patch so you can use it later, and I'm going to call it scale player messy, because it's kind of a bit of a tangle up here, and I promise I'll make another one called scale player cleaned up that is the exact same patch, but a little bit easier to read. Okay, so there's a patch that can pretty much go up and down whatever scale you choose to type in. So just to review, we learned how to make an amplitude envelope. We used the line tilde object to give us just a simple 2-segment attack release envelope, and then we applied that envelope with multiplication to our sawtooth wave to make little individual notes. We built a whole mechanism with our old friends counter and metro that can climb up and down a scale, and we did it in a generic way so that we store the scale in a collection, a call object, and we can refer to different collections, and no matter what are the notes in the collection or how many notes are in the collection, our little program can automatically go up and then back down all those notes and then turn itself off. And that's kind of the tip of the iceberg of a whole huge category of Max patches that you can build of what I would call a little musical agent. It doesn't have to be music either. It could be video or whatever kind of thing you want to do with Max. But the idea that you've got a little piece of your program that can perform an autonomous behavior. You can say just go do your thing, and it makes some little sequence of things happen, and it finishes, or maybe it loops. And this idea that instead of just controlling every event directly by bashing on the keyboard or moving the mouse around or something, that you could have this pre-programmed behavior that you can say, okay, play the scale now, and it can play the scale, and you don't have to think about it. You just kind of set it off and it'll do its thing. So you can imagine making a patch that had a whole bunch of these scale players and some high-level logic that triggers the scales based on some other thing that your patch can compute, and you're sort of becoming more of, rather than a musician that's playing every note individually, you're kind of stepping back and becoming a conductor that is sort of saying, okay, you do your thing, and let Max fill in the details. That's a very fun way to work. What else did we learn in this session? We learned about the call object. We learned about the refer message to the call object, and we also learned about the length message to the call object, and we used it with an object called grab that subverts the normal rules about how data typically flows from outlets to inlets, and lets you sort of steal data that would have come out of an object's outlet, but it comes out of grab's outlet instead, which was very useful in this case. Next thing I want to talk about is this idea of octave equivalence. So if I have a certain note, let me pull up this simple Max patch here. Octave the multiples of 2. So here's just a 150 hertz sine wave. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. So now if I want to do it up an octave, twinkle, twinkle, little star. Like my voice doesn't really go that high very well, but it's in a sense it's the same key. So this 150 hertz versus 300 hertz, it's perceptually these can be thought of as the same note, even though they're an octave apart. These frequencies are a factor of 2 away from each other, but they are in some perceptual sense the same. So there's a wonderful way to visualize this that comes from Robisch from 1855. This idea of the pitch spiral. So instead of like on a piano, there's just a linear array all the way from low to high, but you get to C in a sense you're back where you started. So Robisch had this idea of making it a spiral. So you start with C and you go around and around D, F, G, A, B, and when you get to C, you're back where you started, but higher. So as you're looking down on it, you've got a sort of a circle that's all the possible infinitely many pitches within one octave. But if you look at it from the side, you see, well, here's a C, and then here's a C in the next octave, and here's a C in the next octave. So as you keep climbing the spiral, you're in some sense higher than when you started, but in another sense, you are back where you started. So the spiral kind of it takes a one-dimensional thing and turns it into a sort of a two-dimensional thing. Many scales repeat at the octave. In fact, most of the scales that you're probably familiar with do repeat at the octave. You can find some exceptions that don't, but for the most part, if you are going do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, then you have one octave's worth. And if you start there in do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, it's the same scale here as here. Every one of the notes in this octave is one octave higher than the same note in the previous octave. So when we have a scale that repeats at the octave, we can treat the octave as a sort of separate thing, and then all we need is to have one scale. We only need one octave of the scale, and then we can use some math to extend that over multiple scales. So let's do that on the computer here. Okay, so our scale's supposed to repeat at the octave. That's not built into this patch yet. This patch only has one octave built in. So after we get up to the octave, it doesn't keep going. So I can keep putting the scale degree higher and higher and higher and higher, but we only have data for the first 8 notes of the scale. So once we get to the octave, nothing else is coming out. So let's build a little program logic that can deal with that. So the first thing is that we're numbering these scale degrees starting from 1. That's normally how people count, 1 origin. But it's going to turn out a lot easier if we do this 0 origin. So I'm going to subtract 1 from all these numbers. I'm going to say the scale begins at degree number 0, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then when we get to the octave, we'll be at number 7. So let's save that. So far I haven't changed anything to the way we control it. Now we go to say 0. Okay, but now what we're going to do, we're going to take advantage of the fact that we know, that this scale repeats at the octave. So we're going to take our number for our scale degree, and we're going to divide it by 8. No, by 7, and that's going to tell us which octave we're in, and we're going to modulo it by 8, and that's going to tell us what scale degree it is within that octave. So as I go from 0 up to 7, those are the notes of one octave, and then when I get to 8, I should be back where I started at 0, but now in the next octave, octave 1. And now 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 are all in this octave that we're calling 1, and then I go to the next one, boom, and I'm in 2. So now I can count up forever. And when I get to the end of the scale, it just takes me to the next octave. So this one on the left, the result of the division, is the octave, aka pitch height, according to this way of talking about things. And then on this side is what we'll call the pitch class, aka scale degree. So now we know which octave we're in, and we know the scale degree within that octave. And here's the key point, let me just emphasize this. The scale degree within an octave is never higher than 7. It goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then you try to go up by 1 and you go to the next octave. Okay, so that's good. And that, by the way, is why we did 0 origin numbering here, starting at 0 rather than starting at 1, because when you do a modulo, it naturally, the lowest possible value is 0. So if the number is exactly a multiple of 8, then 8 divided by 8 has a remainder of 0. So we want to start the octave on number 0. Okay, so now we got the octave, and we've got the pitch class. So we're going to use the pitch class to look up one of the particular notes of our scale. And then we're going to take the octave, and after we figure out which, well, there's 2 ways to apply the octave. To go up an octave in MIDI space, we just add 12. So if it's 1 octave higher, we're just going to multiply that by 12, and that's going to tell us how many half steps to go up. And we're going to get back to the correct octave by adding that many half steps to the note before we go. So here, I'll put another number box here so we can keep track of it. And we'll add that there. And notice that we're adding 2 things. So we want the right one to go in first and the left one to go in second. And that is going to happen because these are both triggered when I change this number. But now that I'm relying on this happening first and this happening second, just to be careful, I'm going to put in a TII, so that even if I clean up this patch later, we're going to for sure figure out the scale degree first and look that up in the major scale and rest it in the cold right inlet of this plus, and then figure out what octave we're in and figure out how many half steps of an offset we need and put that into the right side there. So again, if we start at scale degree 0, we are climbing up the scale. Here, I'll turn sound back on. And now we're in the 7th note of the 0th octave, and I blew it because the 7th note should actually be the 0th note of the next octave. So these shouldn't be 8s, these should be 7, because there's 7 notes in the scale. That's why this terminology is confusing. Everybody would just always use 0 origin for everything. It'd be a lot easier. So let's try that again. We'll start at 0, and the next one should be in the next octave. There we go. So we can pretty easily go to near the extreme limits of human hearing and beyond. And in fact, we can get some really bizarre notes because we're aliasing, because we're asking for frequencies that are well above the sampling rate, and so we're getting crazy pitches. So let's not go above 20 kilohertz. But if we want to be in the, that works there. So there's how we can deal with octaves. We can have a large number of possible scale degrees, and for each one, given that we're using 7-note scales, we divide the scale degree by 7. That tells us what octave we're in, and then we modulo the scale degree by 7. That tells us which note within that octave we want. Then we can look up that note in our 1 octave collection, and then we can add the octave back in, and then we also add in the bass note. So there's a big D major scale we can go down to C. And there we go. So I'm going to reemphasize that not every scale repeats at the octave, even though we just built a patch that has the idea of a 7-note scale repeating at the octave built in. There are some scales that don't, and perhaps the most famous, certainly in computer music, is the Bullen-Peer scale, which has its own Wikipedia article. And it doesn't repeat at the octave, it repeats at the octave plus a fifth, the 3-to-1 frequency ratio. And then they divide that in a equal tempered way into various 13 steps, either equal tempered or you can do justly tuned, blah, blah, blah. We'll talk more about just intonation versus equal temperament a little bit later. Just want to put it out there that there are other scales in the world that don't repeat at the octave, and the Bullen-Peer scale is a good example of that.
Aliasing is a fascinating phenomenon that happens when you sample a periodic signal and try to reconstruct it from the samples. Let me show you how it happens. First, we need to make some waves. Now let's add sampling to this signal, which means taking measurements at fixed intervals. These samples, however, are just data points. You need a way to reconstruct the signal. The simplest way is to connect the dots. Now watch what happens when I stretch out the samples, reducing the sample rate. In graphics, this would be zooming out. You reach a point where you only have two samples for each period of the wave, one for the peak, one for the trough. This is commonly referred to as the Nyquist rate. When you go further, that's when aliasing happens, which means the reconstructed signal does not match the original. It's an alias, a ghost image. It makes you see things that aren't really there, so it's best if you try to avoid it.
Aliasing is